completely different film than the one we saw last week. Completely different from the films that started Cinemaball. But man, we are taking y'all on a fantastic journey in this show. And I am so glad we chose to do this. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Cinemaball. I am here with my co-host, my opponent, and my idol, Carolyn Pettit. Hey Carolyn.
Aw. Hey Ebony.
So listen, anyone listening to this podcast can tell I still have a cold. I don't know what to tell you. I have important things to say, so I resisted the allure of my incredibly comfortable bed and the disco blue cough medicine I normally drink 17 times a day to come into the studio and talk to you because Cinemaball is life. What is Cinemaball? It is a ridiculous excuse for Carol and I to talk about movies, and I do mean ridiculous. Carolyn's goal in the game of Cinemaball is to connect one movie to another through an actor, a director, someone else involved in the film, until she gets us to the 1998 Jean-Claude Van Damme film Knockoff, which I am really desperately trying to keep us from. I am on defense this round. I want to make sure we don't have to watch the Jean-Claude Van Damme film Knockoff, if at all possible. Last week, Carolyn shifted the Cinemaball from the 2014 modern horror classic It Follows to the 2015 drama Louder Than Bombs. At the end of this episode, I'm going to announce our next film, but for right now, it's time to delve into the dysfunctional family drama of Louder Than Bombs. Caro, break it down for us. Tell us a little bit about this movie and why you chose it.
Okay, so Louder Than Bombs is the first English language film from a very, well-respected Norwegian director named Joachim Trier. I've actually not seen any of his other films yet, but last year, 2017, he released a Norwegian film called Thelma, which I've heard is just exceptional, and it's definitely on my list of films to watch. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But it really wasn't so much the director that led me to choose this film as it was one of its stars, the Irish actor Gabriel Byrne. He's just an actor that I've always just loved watching on screen because I feel like he has so much charisma, but it's a very specific kind of charisma. It's a kind of internal charisma. It's the kind of thing where you look at him and it just seems like you could just get the sense that there's so much going on like inside of him that you kind of can't take your eyes off him. It's not the outward kind of big sort of charisma that some actors have. It's a very intense charisma that seems to kind of exist within and just manifest in his eyes and his face. So folks may know him as the sort of Irish criminal in The Usual Suspects, the one who sort of throughout the film seems like the most likely candidate to actually be Kaiser Soze until you find out that verbal Kent is actually Kaiser Soze. Also, he had an HBO series called In Treatment. There was an HBO series called In Treatment in which every episode was basically a half-hour little therapy session with him as the therapist and some actor as his client. So you get so many like just intense Gabriel Byrne looks and stuff in that show. So even though I thought the show was really uneven at times, I still couldn't resist watching it just because of his presence. And that was really the main reason that I chose this film, was because of him, and because I got a sense from the description that it would be a good opportunity for him to really work that Gabriel Byrne charisma, and I wasn't wrong about that. Like, the film certainly, I think, delivers the complexity, the sort of internalized complexity that I want to see in a Gabriel Byrne performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna interrupt you real quick before
Yeah.
I throw it back to you to give a short summary of the film.
Yeah.
But just in regards to Gabriel Byrne, I absolutely agree with your characterization of him. He has been a really fascinating actor to watch through the years. I mean, the man's almost 70. I think he's like 68 or something, right?
Yeah.
He's still very attractive. But the transformation of Gabriel Byrne over the past like 3 or 4 decades in film from someone, and this is actually alluded to in Louder Than Bombs when he talks about his brief career as an actor, right? And he says, my agent thought my looks would actually hamper me from being taken seriously. And I think, I would hesitate to suggest that his phenomenal good looks when he was a younger man were some sort of something that held him back. But I do think the magnetism that he conveys, like you want to look at him, he is a very quiet but full actor who managed to suggest this just profound interiority in a way that draws you in. It's not overblown. It's not sort of, loud and jumping on the couchy Tom Cruise style charisma. You very much, like this show In Treatment, which I have not seen. But I wanted to watch it. I've seen tons of other Gabriel Byrne pieces. And yes, when he is on screen, you want to lean in, and listen to him more closely. And so I thought he was just an exceptional choice for the role of Gene in this movie.
Yes.
So just give us a quick breakdown of what the movie's about.
Yeah. So he plays a widower named Jean. His wife, who is played by the quite legendary French actor Isabelle Huppert, plays and who is sort of in many ways his equal in terms of that ability to project this kind of intelligence and intensity. Plays his deceased wife, who was a war photographer. Very, very well respected, very, important kind of war photographer, who didn't die on assignment in some, war-torn country, as you might suspect, but rather died in a car accident just like a mile from the family home. And it's suspected by Jean and others that that it was not an accident, that she committed suicide. But Jean's 2 sons don't know this. One of his sons is Jonah, played by Jesse Eisenberg. So he's a young sort of college professor. He's just had a baby with his young wife. And then there's young Conrad, who was only 12 when Isabelle died, so he's probably around like 15 now, and is still very, very troubled. Like clearly is not processing the loss of his mother in a healthy way at all. He's very he's very introverted. He's very
he plays video games, Caro.
Yeah,
that's
that
tells us all we need to know, right? When you see someone playing video games on screen, you know that he's not engaging with people socially.
Yes. Warnings, red flags, warning signs. He plays video games. But although his obsession with video games does lead to one of the more interesting dialogue exchanges in the film. So Jonah. I keep wanting to call Jonah Jesse because he's played by Jesse Eisenberg, and their names both start with J. But so Jonah comes up to the house. There's going to be a big retrospective on Isabelle's work and her life printed in the New York Times. And there's all these photos that are still like in her office that haven't been sorted through. And so Jonah comes up to the house ostensibly to kind of help Jean, and kind of go through that stuff and figure out what might be useful to have in this exhibition that's also happening at a New York gallery. But it's also clear that Jonah has his own problems. He is kind of hiding. You're sort of retreating from his wife and the baby. He's kind of, he's kind of using this as an excuse to kind of put a shield or some distance between him and his wife. And so it's really just a drama about the ways in which these three, men and boys, are struggling and fumbling and failing to move on, and to kind of how the loss of Isabelle is affecting each of them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the so just to remind people of how the sausage is made, this is actually the second time we're recording this episode because my Boogle House ass ability to manipulate a Zoom recorder failed me earlier in the week. But one of the things that we talked about the first time we discussed this film is how you have a multi-generational saga here. So you have Gabriel Byrne playing Jean, the widower. You have Jesse Eisenberg playing Jonah. It tickled me throughout the film because I just can't see this dude as anything other than like a college freshman. So to have him portraying like, albeit young, but portraying a sociology professor, a PhD with a new baby, I was just like, who let this young man have a child? But anyway, so you have this young man who, let's say he's late 20s, maybe 30, and then his younger brother who's 16. And the ways in which they grieve differently, but how their entire lives have been shaped by the presence of Isabelle in their lives as either a mother, a wife, a mother of, a firstborn son, mother of a much younger secondborn son, or, as the wife of Jean, right? So there's this attempt to capture who she was, and they continually have this tension when they talk about who Isabelle was. But in many ways, none of them have the true picture of who she was, because it's impossible for them to know. They are talking about three different women when they speak about this singular person in their lives. And I love the way the movie occasionally gives us hints of this. So we do see Isabelle in flashbacks occasionally, and the memories of Conrad or Jean or Jesse or Jonah, but most often we see her an interview she gave with Charlie Rose, so it's her on camera, or we see images of her that she took in mirrors, right? So again, it's not the person, it's a reflection of that person. It's that person captured on film. In many ways, it's kind of a simulacrum, like it's a recreation of an identity that doesn't have like an original referent. And I thought that was very well done, because the grief and the trauma that these men are trying to move through, not move past, but move through, has become so overwhelming. All they can do is try and hold on to the image of Isabelle that they had, And so for Jean to say, well, this is who I knew as my wife, to have that butt up against, Jonah's idea of his mother, causes some real tension, and it causes really extreme like painful interactions with his younger son, to the point where you wonder if their relationship will ever be whole.
I think, to your point about how Isabelle is, a different woman through the lens of each of these men's experiences of her and with her. There's a really great little sequence in the film where Isabelle was a photographer, and one thing that Conrad recollects at one point is that Isabelle once showed him how you could change the meaning of a photograph by how you framed it. So, for instance, there's a photo of a family like walking toward the camera, and it just seems like a mother and her kids like walking, but then the frame expands and you see what I think is like an IRA gunman just around the corner up ahead of them. And, there's another photo of just this, cute young girl walking and holding someone's hand. But then and you think, and then the frame expands, and it's she's holding Hitler's hand, so it's very much changes the emotional sort of reverberations of that image. And I think that you could say that each of these three men, saw Isabelle through a different framing, right? The framing of their relationship with her, and so the meanings that she had for each of them were, of course, very different. But she was tremendously important in her own way to all of them.
Right, and there's also the fourth man, played by David Strathern, the reporter,
Yes.
the colleague who is going to be writing this piece in the New York Times. And it's interesting that he also has a different knowledge of Isabelle because they were colleagues, So his knowledge of her is not the domestic knowledge that that her husband or children had, but rather someone who knew her through her chosen avocation, right? But also knew her intimately. We learned that they had an affair. We have no idea how long that affair has gone on, but we know that she took it seriously enough and thought enough of it to try and keep it separate from her family. So this is a part of her that Isabelle wanted to keep to herself, So again, this is another there's another facet of her identity that went into creating the whole richness of Isabelle, that because she is no longer with us, it's just simply inaccessible to the men who are left.
Yes.
The one, well, I shouldn't say the one problem. I really enjoyed this film. And one of the things I told you before is that I'm glad you chose it, because there's no way I would have chosen to watch this on my own. Basically, if I'm not rewatching like Eureka, Warehouse 13, or some Scandinavian crime drama, I'm reading comic books, So it is rare that I'm like, you know what? I would like to watch a quiet, thoughtful, slow-paced, kind of cinematic observation of human relations. And yet, whenever you and Anita force, in quotation marks, force me to watch something like this or Call Me By Your Name, I'm always like, yeah.
To be fair, these are very much not Anita movies either. Like, this is 100%, like, my jam is observational, human, character-driven dramas, right? That is like, if you're gonna have one genre that you have to say, like, that's what a Caro movie is,
right?
It's this genre. So
I mean, Anita and I are saving money to buy you like the complete Criterion collection, and once we do, we know that you're never gonna leave your apartment again. But but I mean, at least Anita, as a media critic, will acknowledge that, like, okay, there are movies that will bear fruit, thoughtful fruit in a discussion. Let's watch them. My reaction is always like, I don't want to watch a thoughtful movie. I want to watch a smart movie. So, having said that, I am very glad I watched this movie. There were things that I absolutely loved about it. There were some things, though, that I found problematic, and I know that term itself gets way overused, but in as much as I thought the film was doing something very smart about conveying to us the fact that it's impossible for these men or for us as an audience to ever get a true picture of who Isabelle was. Like, that is a futile hope. Nevertheless, I thought the movie itself, was part of a cinematic genre in which women are inciters of action. They are the ones who provoke male emotion and legitimize male emotion by their absence. And yet they are rarely allowed to speak and deliver their own stories. So, it is very common for the death of a mother, a lover, something like that, to, provoke a male actor, a male subject to, like, a revenge drama, or, like even a teenage sex comedy, like the woman who is not there, the woman that the man cannot have. And so there was a way in which I was a little bit dissatisfied by the fact that, Isabelle is this fascinating character, but what we learn of her is very rarely in her own words.
Yes.
It's primarily through the recollections of these men. And yes, we do get, these interviews, like when she talks about, or when she's on Charlie Rose giving that interview. And those are absolutely fascinating, compelling moments when she's allowed to speak for herself, you know, and talk about why she does the things that she does, why she's not planning on stopping, why she sees no need to stop. You know, why this is not just
Yeah.
a job for her, but rather something she feels called to do. Those were the moments that I was most drawn in to this movie because, yeah, for a large part of it, I was like, okay, I get it. You know, you feel sad, Gene. You feel sad, Conrad, with your fucking 16-year-old self-obsessed, no one has ever been as sad as I have been. No one has ever been as deep as I am, you know, ass. But I wanted more Isabelle. But this is not a story about her. This is a story
Right.
about the men she's left behind.
Yeah, and I mean, so yeah, there's exactly like there's a sense in which she, for the story to function, she needs to remain this kind of ethereal, fully knowable presence, right? But you're right. I mean, the one there's one bit of voiceover that we get from her that I did really appreciate, which and I thought was quite sort of insightful, where she talks about you know, but by being this kind of war photographer, the toll that takes, or the difficulty of that, is that you go abroad, you're in this, place, this horrible, where all these horrible things are happening, and of course, some part of you really wants to return home, longs to return home, but then each time you return home, you feel like an outsider because it's been a month or 2 months since you were home last. People are talking about the culture, the things have shifted away from you. There's new films or new TV shows being discussed, new things, just new developments in the family's arc, its relationships, and so you at least she says, that she feels like she's almost in the way when she comes home because she cannot fully integrate into whatever's happening because by necessity her work requires that she spend so much time away. And so I thought that was an interesting opportunity for us to kind of understand because Jean doesn't fully understand and gets quite angry at her for wanting to continue doing the work that she does. He accuses her of being addicted to the the chaos, the intensity of those places. But so I appreciated that it gave her that chance to like articulate her feelings about it to us, the audience. But I agree completely that, and I think this is an example of a way in which a story like this wouldn't. It would be completely fine if we existed in a more equitable, sort of ecosystem of films where all different kinds of stories were being told. But as it stands, this is a story that does fall into a pattern that tends to center men's experiences, men's emotions as over those of women. Another aspect in which the film kind of troubled me a little bit similarly was that it's, we see a lot of Isabelle's photographs throughout the film, and they're extraordinary photographs, but, and, they're photographs of people just experiencing, absolute devastation and loss of life and I mean, in extreme poverty and just horrible living conditions, and yet, like, the film, and yet, so it's a story, though, about this white, like, kind of at least, like, well-to-do or, like, at least upper middle class kind of New York family. And, so it doesn't, I guess I wish that it engaged a bit more with what our experiences or our relationships as Westerners are, I guess, to these images that, that, I mean, Isabelle takes a photograph there and it ends up on the front page of the New York Times or something, but it's still, kind of disposable to us.
Mm-hmm.
We might look at it, we might have a moment of like, relationship to the image in the film, but then we put it aside and we go on with our lives. And, similarly, like this film doesn't, it doesn't really, engage with the the experiences of these people that Isabelle photographs, right?
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
So
I totally agree. I think, there isn't enough of a conversation about larger issues of how Western journalism gets married with cultural anthropology and grief tourism, such that the people that Isabelle has been photographing are being photographed in moments of profound upset, whether that's someone, recently being shot or a family grieving over a lost child. She is there taking pictures, testifying, witnessing, which is itself a very important human activity. But nevertheless, as an outsider, her presence there is intrusive in a way that her family never has to deal with after her loss. So you have these, brown families in, like Syria, what's one of the places that she's mentioned as being, and this very just heartbreaking, intimate moment where they're preparing a young boy's body for burial. She's capturing that moment. There is no analog to have an outsider at her watching her family deal
Right.
with her death, So there's a way in which, like, the grief and the trauma of others is a commodity that needs to be witnessed by white people for it to be real. And the people who are being photographed, the subjects of those pieces, never have to give their permission. It's that autonomy is kind of taken away from them. And there's this, way in which Westerners kind of assume, like, oh, if we see it, if we show the world what's going on, it will become real to them. You think about the arrogance of that statement and that impetus, like, I need to see you bleed. I need to see you in pain before I will recognize that it has actually occurred. So yeah, there's a kind of fucked up, well, not even kind of, there's a fucked up economy to a lot of this that doesn't necessarily get discussed in a way that it would have been nice.
And it's another one of those cases where, if we had films, that obviously these films exist in the global cinema landscape, but they don't get much exposure or attention here. If we were exposed as Western audiences to a lot of films that told the stories of those people and really, humanized their lives and their experiences for us, I wouldn't so much have a problem with one film that focuses more on the grief of a white, like, because obviously the experiences and the grief of this family are valid too, right?
Yeah.
But it's just that it sort of illuminates the imbalance, right? By having these scenes of devastation and grief in places like Syria, but then focusing entirely on the grief of this, this white New York family. It's like, oh, right, we are not encouraged or inclined very often to really know or identify with or project ourselves onto the experiences of those people, right? So yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I've been thinking about since watching this film is I do wonder how the film would necessarily have been different if it were gender flipped. So if Isabelle were a male war photographer who had died, and the people that we were watching were, the widow and two children, and what that would have looked like. I think there probably would have been more focus on the main character who had died. Let's just say Jean in this hypothetical situation. I think there would have been more emphasis on the heroism and the bravery of that person going into these war zones, right? And that's something that's largely missing. I think in a good way, like, I don't want to hear about, the bravery of, these white people who go into these war-torn regions to shoot photographs.
Sure.
But I also do wonder particularly about how the character of Conrad would be different if it were a 16-year-old girl. And how we would understand that character. I found myself making, at the same time that I absolutely wanted to, like, squeeze Conrad's fucking head, because he was just I get it. I get it. Like, at 16 is such a hard age. It is such
Mm-hmm.
a hard age. Like, you're going through so much and trying to figure out so much at a time when the world just seems so incredibly cruel, you know. And if you're not someone who's at the top of the social hierarchy, which Conrad clearly isn't, you don't have a lot of grace period to make fuck ups, you know, in front of others. But I do think that, you know, we definitely um permit, like, if there's anyone who's gonna be just like a straight up asshole, the person we're most likely to give permission to do that is going to be like a straight white young
Yeah.
man who is upset about something, right?
Yeah.
So there's a joke, and it's funny, but it's also kind of horrifying when Jonah is watching Conrad play video games, and I can't remember what Conrad says, but Jonah says, like, "You're not going to go shoot up a school, are you?" And it's meant to be a kind of funny moment, right? But I'm thinking,
Yeah.
if the situations were reversed, and if this was a 16-year-old girl, that wouldn't even be an issue, right? Like, that wouldn't even be a joke that would be
Right.
made. Because I think the assumption would be, the reality would be, that a young girl dealing with this kind of trauma would necessarily turn that hurt inward versus
Yes.
outward. You know?
Right. Right.
And so I think,
right.
you know, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that this movie needs to be, you know, gender flipped to be better or anything, but I do think it would be interesting to note, like, how this would
Yeah.
play out differently. I also think there would be less emphasis on like the sexual needs of the
Right.
widow, you know, after the death of her partner. I think in a lot of ways, like, after a woman is divorced or, you know, loses a spouse, straight women, you know, it's just kind of assumed, like, oh, she may be single forever. She may never have sex again. In a way that, like, women, or with men, it's like, oh no, if it's a straight dude and he loses his partner, he's gonna need to have sex again. That's just natural, you know.
Yeah,
Of course, he's
yeah.
gonna find another partner, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know. But
No,
I do think it would be
and
different for a woman.
and to be fair, like so Jean in the film has a relationship with unfortunately with Conrad's English teacher, whose
Yeah.
name is Hannah, played by Amy Ryan, herself a very very sort of accomplished and fine actor. And like I didn't. I mean, to me that was as much about emotional. An emotional need for connection and someone to talk to and be close with as it was for you know, anything sexual. At least to me, like, it seemed like I didn't get the sense that it was just all about sex. So
No, I didn't think, not that
No.
particular episode, but when he's with her the first time, he says, "This is the first time that I've had sex, really," you know, because he's tried before.
No,
and
right, and he was too uptight, yeah.
So this may be, in fact, it is probably my inner, you know, moral finger wagger, being like, all right, your wife died 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're just now hooking up with Hannah. That's totally fine. But, like, when did these other, you know, dalliances, when did you attempt to do those? Just like, you know, let it sit a bit, dude.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
let it sit a
Yeah.
bit. But this is me
Yeah.
policing someone else's grief process, which you should never, ever, ever, ever do. So to pretend you didn't hear that, podcast listeners.
So yeah, but I think so, you know, at a certain point in the film, Conrad is very, very upset, I guess understandably, when he learns that Jean and Hannah have been having a relationship. But you know, and Jean, like, apologizes. He's like, it was wrong of me, you know, but I guess I wasn't clear if he was apologizing just for having a relationship with any woman or for having a relationship with his English teacher in particular, because I don't see anything like anything morally wrong or objectionable about Jean having a relationship with a woman, like, for some 3 years after his wife has died.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about how Conrad is processing the grief or not processing it. I think that the film, to me, the film is simultaneously too hard and too easy on Conrad in some ways.
Definitely.
You know, there's a scene where he's just totally rocking out in his room and just listening to music, like, alone, and really, like, physically just dancing like wild, you know. And then Jonah happens to, like, come upon him and just, like, kind of, to me, mercilessly is, like, laughing and keeps telling Conrad, like, that was really weird. I
Right.
mean, no, it was funny. It was funny, but it was weird. And I'm like, I don't think it's that weird. Like, at least, I mean, I've certainly rocked out in the privacy of my own home at times, or let off some emotional steam by just cranking up some music and like dancing around or whatever. So, I have a lot of sympathy for that kind of awkwardness and on Conrad's part. But another thing Conrad does, so Conrad is obsessed with this girl in his classes, who he doesn't know at all as a person. He's never like interacted with her. She's of a different strata. She's much like cooler kids realm, and she probably wouldn't really give him the time of day or even barely notice that he exists. But yet he writes her this like extremely honest, like I think like multiple pages of just like facts and like observations and like,
it is excruciating.
His innermost thoughts and Jonah, like, sort of, to his credit, although I don't think he phrases it in the best way, advises Conrad against is it Melanie, the girl's name?
Yeah, Melanie.
Advises Conrad against giving Melanie these documents, but nonetheless, Conrad he goes to her house. He knocks on the door. Her dad answers, and he asks, like, is Melanie there? And as Melanie is like gonna come down the stairs, Conrad like just puts it down and runs away, right? Because that's how painfully shy he is, and yet he's literally like bearing his soul to her in these documents. So to be clear, like, here's the level of honesty that's contained in these documents. Like one of the lines that we hear from the document is like something like, the most times I've jacked off in one day, 7. Like, it's those kinds of like facts and
like there's
fun facts.
There's nothing edited out. It is pure
Conrad fun
unfiltered
facts.
Conrad.
Yeah, and like, so. And again, I have so much sympathy for the awkward kid who can't muster up the courage to talk to the person that they are interested in or whatever. I have been there 100%. But where the film goes with this, like that is that I think would be an extremely kind of alarming and freaky thing for a person to receive. It would kind of set off alarm bells. It's certainly not how you go about laying the basis for any kind of like healthy interaction or relationship, right? I mean, obviously you want to get to a point where you know each other well, but you don't do it by having one person just
emotionally vomit. Yeah,
exactly. That's not the path to getting there. And so and yet instead of Melanie kind of flipping out or like keeping her distance and being on guard around Conrad, they end up at the same party. And Conrad ends up like walking her home from the party, and they kind of have this nice, stroll, this nice night together. And Melanie apparently says like, oh, let's have lunch on Tuesday or something. And Conrad in his head knows that that's never going to happen, that, this night with her is like all that he gets probably. And yet it's still like this nice thing that they shared. And I just, I guess I wasn't happy with the fact that it was sort of in the end treated almost as this like sweet romantic gesture,
right?
Because so often that happens in movies where these things men do that should be kind of, scary or inappropriate, or whatever, are framed as like romantic or sweet.
Yeah, it's incumbent upon the female object of affection to see past any, inappropriate contours to the grand romantic gesture and see the inner truth of the man within, which is both completely unfair for the woman, but also the gesture itself, as you say, is completely inappropriate. Like, all Melanie knows of Conrad, if she knows anything, is that this is someone who's in, one of her classes. And if she's been paying attention and has seen, the dude follows her around town, watches her when she's at cheerleading practice. Like, all she could know of him is that he's kind of stalkery. In fact, it's not even kind of stalkery. He straight up stalks her. So the fact that she, to demonstrate that she is a sweet person, to demonstrate that fact, the fact that she then is, if not receptive, at least not, repulsed by this gesture that he's made. Yeah, it's fucked up, and it's a really gross message that consistently is told
Right.
to women and men, that what's important is not who you are and what you want. The most important thing is, I, the dude, am obsessed with you, and I need you to deal with that fact and be okay
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah, and meanwhile, we have Jonah, who, obviously, for whatever reason, not wanting to face the responsibilities or anything associated with his wife, his marriage, his newborn baby, right? He's going to kind of great lengths to not engage with that, not deal with that. And one night he actually stops by the home of an ex, and they're talking, and he kind of uses some sort of like manipulative language, like, yeah, just like, I have a lot going on right now, actually, which is definitely this kind of coded language for like,
Yeah.
kind of, can I stay here with you tonight, sort of thing,
Right.
which he does, and but I mean, yeah, like, I appreciate that people in grieving situations will make sort of inappropriate or unhealthy decisions sometimes, right? And that's I like that the film is just kind of observant about that. But I do think, again, there's a tendency for us to be a tendency as viewers, because we've been trained to be this way by movies, to be more forgiving and understanding of a male character doing that sort of thing than we would of a female character doing that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I do. I think that there's a sense in which, as I said, these men are only able to access certain levels of emotional depth through their relationships to women, through their interactions with women. And one of the things that I found really interesting was, so as we said, Conrad, plays video games, and that's meant to demonstrate, that he's kind of unplugged from the world around him, and instead chosen to invest himself more deeply in these fictional, fantastical realms, right? And there's a moment when, his father is like, I wanted to try and interact with him, so I spent all this time in, this game. He was playing Elder Scrolls, constructing my character, and there's this very funny moment where he spends hours doing that, and when he finally comes across Conrad in the game, Conrad, without a word, without interacting with him, just cuts him down.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's this very funny thing. But Conrad, in that moment, is playing as a sorceress, right? And so I thought there was something very interesting about the times that he plays as a female character. But also, there's a moment in the school when he's in his English class with Hannah, the teacher that his father is stooping, and his voiceover is Melanie's voice. So she's she's reading something, but we're supposed to understand it as Conrad kind of repeating these things to himself, expressing these same thoughts about like moments of time, replaying over and over again, something about like, the seconds after seconds, etc. But it's a woman's voice, and so I thought that was very interesting that, I'm still unpacking how I'm reading that moment. But again, I do think this is part of this kind of long, fictive tradition of men not knowing how to express themselves unless it's through interactions with women or taking on what they assume to be a more feminine capability to process things emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, so this is a film, in terms of its story, like I feel like it's an unspoilable film. Like you
Yeah.
can't sort of tell people, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story, and have them have a like lesser experience with the film, because it's not really about what happens throughout the film. It's about observing the characters in those situations and in those moments. So, I definitely appreciate that it is a film that doesn't end with any kind of neat, tidy resolutions, right? These characters are all, I mean, they may make some progress. Certainly by the end, we get the sense that Conrad and Jean have somehow kind of broken down maybe one of the walls that was standing in between them, and are now in a place where Conrad realizes that he needs to be, or wants to be, a little more communicative and with his father. And yet, they're all still kind of, I don't want to say broken, but they're all still, I mean, damaged people. I mean, in the sense that most of us are damaged to one degree or another, right? And we carry that damage with us through our lives, and we carry it as well as we can in a way that will allow us to live and to function and to have meaningful lives. So, I tend to like films where they're sort of honest about life in that way, and don't try to affix a kind of overly neat resolution onto circumstances that seem authentic,
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Wow. A completely different film than the one we saw last week. Completely different from the films that started Cinemaball. But man, we are taking y'all on a fantastic journey in this
Yes.
show. And I am so glad we chose to do this. Let us finish up this episode, Carol, by letting the
Yes.
listeners in on our Furious Five or our Fab Five. So just as a reminder for people, this is where we do a speed round of things that we loved or hated about the film for whatever reason. You don't got to defend it. You just got to lay it out there. So, Kara, run us down your list first.
All right, my Fab Five for this film. Easy. This film scores easy points. With Gabriel Byrne's eyes, just have anytime he's on screen basically, and I can just like look into those eyes and see them kind of indicating the sorrow and the processing happening inside of him. I'm a happy viewer. I could just watch that forever. Another strong asset for this film, I would say, is Isabelle Huppert's eyes. Again, like they don't get many scenes together, but when they do, I feel like it's like, oh, I can see a man of Jean's like obvious sort of intelligence and everything being drawn to a woman of Isabelle's obvious kind of like intelligence and complexity and everything. Like they're just two actors who makes sense together for me in that way, right? Like, oh, I imagine these two would have like a definitely a complicated relationship, a complicated marriage, and yet one that they would both find like some kind of satisfaction in those complications, right? So I really appreciated that. The scene where so Conrad is playing some military shooter or other, and Jonah asks something like, "Don't you think those games are kind of dumb?" or something like that. Conrad responds, and then Jonah says, they're a very one-sided depiction of American military imperialism or something like that. And I was like, yes, Jonah, that's 100% correct. They absolutely are. And yet Conrad, replies with, "It's very realistic," which is the kind of bullshit line that I think a lot of like quote unquote hardcore gamers or people who really enjoy like military shooters might actually say that they somehow provide some kind of realistic experience, when if you're talking about like I don't know. I don't think there's any. I think it's pretty unrealistic. Any game in which you play as somebody who like mows down, dozens of enemies, right? That's not really how
Right.
conflict works most of the time. Number 4 for me was the sequence you mentioned of Gene playing Elder Scrolls Online. He just goes through, poor guy, he
I
goes through all
know.
this work. You have to put in so much time, like leveling up the character, developing the character so he can get out into the area where he can maybe find Conrad, and then, he finds Conrad, maybe his character does like a little friendly wave, and then Conrad just comes over and just like slices him down in one hit. And to be clear for anyone listening, like Conrad doesn't know that it's Gene.
Yeah.
Like that's just how Conrad apparently would treat like just about any random character who approaches him. So tells you a little something, I guess, about how Conrad's handling things. And yeah, and finally the sequence that I mentioned earlier about how framing a photo can change its meaning. I thought that was a really effective illustration of something very true, and something that we should think about as viewers, as consumers of media, in terms of not just still photography, but like the stories that we watch. If we're watching a crime drama, and is the story being framed in such a way to make us more sympathetic, or for the police, but maybe we don't know the full story of what's going on in the lives of the other people, for instance, or whatever it is, right? We're always, every story, pretty much has like inherent kind of biases, right? That are not like made overt, but are there, and it's good for us to be mindful of that as viewers and players and readers and fans.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so my mix of Fab Five and Furious Five, I'm going to cheat because I cheat all the time. So as I said, we recorded this show earlier. Show didn't get recorded, so we're doing it again. I have taken the opportunity to tweak some of my Furious Five. I know, I'm being completely dishonest, but no one would have known if I hadn't revealed it to you. But I'm going to cheat, but I'm going to be honest about cheating. So some of them are the same, some are different. One. Gabriel Byrne, you and I are right here. We are on the same page with the Gabriel Byrne love. Like, I could look at that dude for hours. So there is the way that he holds his body and communicates, just expresses the way he's been completely hollowed out by the grief. And I just was so moved by this, and the tiny gestures he tries to make to stay connected to his son, Conrad, like taco night, It was such a small thing, but he was just trying so hard, and he just had you could tell he thought that, he had such paltry tools left available to him to connect. So just Gabriel Byrne, just love that guy, luminous on screen. Talking about video games, I fucking love it when the playing of video games is used as a narrative shorthand, to suggest something about someone, because it's always like a first-person shooter or something super violent. It's never like, oh, hey, I've been playing Donkey Kong and, just really, processing my shit that way. But somehow it's always just something grimdark. So I don't know why I love it, but I absolutely do. Number 3 on my list, Gabriel Byrne's accent. Couldn't place it, didn't know what it was going to be from scene to scene.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I completely bought into it because, the dude has, apparently lived in the U.S. for several decades. So I buy the transatlantic mismatch, but, it just was a delightful little thing that tickled me that I didn't know where his accent was going to go left or right, and there was really no explanation for it. Whatever. Number 4. The naturalistic way in which this was filmed. Not completely, because there are fantastical moments in the film. Like when Conrad thinks he's able to conjure up wind to move Melanie's hair.
Right.
Or things like that. But for the most part, it's done in this very quiet, deliberate, naturalistic way. the lighting, there are times when, a person's face would be half in shadow and you couldn't really see their face in its fullness. Sometimes the sound was so quiet, it almost felt oppressive because there was no kind of like non-diegetic music behind it. It just felt very real, in quotation marks. And yeah, we could unpack what that means, but it worked so well for the pacing and the feel of this movie, to not have this kind of like glossy, ultra high def, version of these people. I really appreciated that. And then my final thing is when Jonah comes back to the family home and he's in his mother's workspace going through like old negatives and slides and, her work. The way that he and his father move around and touch things really, to me, was such an accurate portrayal of how the physical handling of someone's things can be. Sometimes you pick them up and you don't want to put them back down again, because it's a tangible connection to that person. And so these things, which on their own may not mean much, take on this huge outsized importance for you. And for Jonah, this is certainly the case, right? He considers himself like a steward of his mother's work. He wants to make sure that her work is not being used inappropriately, or that, messaging is not getting, mixed up, that the retrospective of her work is going to accurately convey who she was and what she did. But just like the physical act of touching the things that belong to a dead person, and how you don't want to get rid of them,
Yes, absolutely.
That was a really moving and touching moment for me. So yeah, that's where I came down on my Furious 5 / Fab 5 / Funny 5. But now it is time for us, dear listeners, to render our verdicts on this film. We're going to be using my brother Brian's patented, trademarked, copyrighted 100-star scale. So, as you know, on each episode, we rate the films that we watch. We keep a list of our ratings in a document that you can find in the podcast description. So, Caro, start us off here. How do you rate Louder Than Bombs?
So yeah, it's a film in the genre that is like my favorite genre. I mean, it's got Gabriel Byrne. It's got great moments, great things. It didn't, for me, come together in such a way ultimately to really kind of be among the best of the genre, but I still really valued, watching the film, my time with these characters, my time getting to watch them, just feel things and process things and interact with each other. So I am giving this film a 70 stars out of 100. Right on.
I am grading this movie on a bit of a curve because, as I said, I tend to watch only genre stuff. So I want to appear smarter than I actually am. So thereby, I'm going to grade this film on a curve to suggest that, I'm deeper than I actually am. Absolutely, if you're having a smarty party, put on your glasses, serve some scotch, show this movie to your friends. I'm giving this 72 stars. Yeah. And I feel pretty confident about that 72
Yeah, no,
stars.
I think that's a very
It's fair, right?
solid.
Yeah, it's fair.
Yeah, it's absolutely fair.
Yeah.
All right. So, Ebony,
Oh
yeah. All right. So, time to tell the good folks at home what we're and me ostensibly what we're watching next week.
Let me say this, Carolyn.
Yes.
After watching It Follows and Louder Than Bombs, two very intelligent films, right? Two films that are, very structured and very careful with the way they are constructed. I absolutely did search for a film that would take us so far out of left field that would be kind of painful to watch in its badness, just to kind of mix it up for the people.
Yeah.
But then I remembered, this is the thing about Cinemaball. You don't just like serve the ball into your opponent's court. You have to watch that shit yourself. So I was like, I don't want to get caught up watching some garbage either. So
Yeah.
instead, I decided to link Cinemaball via one of my favorite actors. I
Link-
love Gabriel
louder-
Byrne, absolutely.
Link
but
louder than bombs.
or excuse me, Louder Than Bombs. I am connecting it via David Strathairn, one of my favorite actors, to the 1997 film L.A. Confidential. I am so excited
Now-
to rewatch this movie and so excited to talk it over with you.
I like the first time, because when we recorded this for the first time and I didn't know what was coming, you said that, I let out an exclamation
You
of
sure did.
absolute glee, because LA Confidential is absolutely one of my all-time favorite films, and I am so excited to get into it with you, because I think there is so much fascinating stuff going on in that movie. It's gonna be great.
Absolutely. Although I feel like I'm not being very strategic because there's so many fucking people in that movie.
There are.
If we're not able to wrap up this round within a couple of films after hitting LA Confidential, I will be surprised because everybody's in that movie.
Yeah, unfortunately, Rob Schneider is not in that film, so that's gonna make it tougher for me to link it in one move to knock off. But I'll see what I can do. All right, everyone. Before we say goodbye, we want to take a quick moment to mention that everything Feminist Frequency produces, including this very podcast, costs money, and that we cannot do all the things we do without the support of you, our fantastic listeners, readers, viewers, and fans. Throughout the month of May, we are running our annual fundraising drive, and this year we have set a goal of $35,000 to help us keep doing this vital work. Please visit feministfrequency.com/donate, or share the fundraising campaign with your friends and help us keep doing our extremely vital, important work and our fun stuff too, like this ridiculousness. Which I like to hope this, that our discussions actually do, shed some. Have some morsels of thought-provoking, insightful stuff that people can take with them into their viewing experiences. But
absolutely.
We're having fun here too.
My hope is that if we can get people to just nod at least once during the course of any particular episode as they commute to work and listen to the podcast, we have done our jobs. So that's going to do it for us this week, folks. Thanks so much to Simplecast, which hosts both this podcast and our flagship show, Feminist Frequency Radio. We will see you back here next week for another round of Cinemaball. Bye, everybody.
See you then.